We'll now continue the discussion of algorithmic bias with a focus on issues related to gender and race. As I said in the last lesson, there's many issues of algorithmic bias that are related to some aspect of identity, whether that's gender, race, age, ethnicity, location, or others. A great portion of those are instances that are related to gender and race, and so that's what we're going to concentrate on for this lesson. To way oversimplify, there seem to be three prominent categories where algorithmic bias related to gender, race, and other forms of identity occur. One of them I would call the who gets selected category. That can include who gets selected for a job, who gets admitted to a university or other organization, who gets a seat on a board, who gets chosen for a position in the civic organization, and so on. The second category is criminal justice. This can include sentences in criminal cases, decisions about the granting of bail, decisions about the granting of parole, or other things that we'll see later here, such as where are police positioned in communities. And the third would be financial decisions, decisions about loans, credit, and other financial issues. You can find a ton of articles about algorithmic bias related to all of these topics. What I've decided to do for this lesson is select a couple of articles for each of the first two categories, the who gets selected, and particularly about issues related to algorithmic bias in hiring, and then the criminal justice, particularly issues about criminal sentencing. At the end of the lesson, we'll also have one interesting article about public policy issues related to algorithmic bias and criminal justice. The first article about algorithmic bias in the hiring process is entitled Amazon Scraps Recruiting Tool That Showed Bias Against Women. This is a fairly simple article. I chose it in part because it got a lot of attention at the time, and also because it makes a number of really important points. What happens is that Amazon wanted to do exactly what we talked about a moment ago. It wanted to make the consideration of a very large number of applicants more efficient by using an algorithm to do the initial screening process. So it trained an algorithm on the resumes of prior successful candidates to help do that. And what it found out after using that for a while is that that algorithm was heavily biased towards selecting men versus women. This was not surprising when one thought about it, because at that time particularly, Amazon's technical workforce was heavily male. And so the algorithm was just learning that those sorts of people are the people that Amazon wants to hire. It should be stated that this was in the period of about 2014 to 2016. So this is the fairly early days of using machine learning for these sorts of applications. And perhaps what is more obvious now was less obvious then. But there's more to it. The subtle part is that even if you removed actually identifying gender as part of that process, which it sounds like they may have done, there's plenty of other clues in an application that correlate to gender and that might lead the algorithm to be able to have the same biases even without gender being an explicit characteristic that it considers. These can include the activities and groups that the person is associated with, or even the language that they use. Let me expound on both of those a little bit. The first one is something that I've noticed extensively in my own hiring experience. In professional resumes, people usually have a long list of professional data first, and then at the end, they often have what I'd call non-professional data, listing of things that they do in the community or other activities that they have. And I've noticed that very often, if you look at those, it gives a lot of clues to identity information about that person. And if you don't want to be considering that, you probably shouldn't be considering that information. As a whimsical example to illustrate the point, if somebody says that they are the president of the local Transylvanian Heritage Society, then you can probably assume that they have some sort of Transylvanian ties themselves. But it's more than just that. And what's really interesting and turns out to be important in a variety of ways is the use of language. So the article mentions that they discovered that there are words that men use in their cover letters much more extensively than women do, and vice versa, of course. So two words that were more male correlated that are mentioned were the word execute and the word capture. And so if the algorithm somehow correlates that people who have done well at Amazon correlate to people who use the word execute in their cover letter, then they're biasing towards gender without gender ever having been a characteristic. By the way, this is going to come up again a little bit later when we talk about hiring advertisements and the use of language in those. So Amazon actually scrapped the use of this tool, at least at that time, but things like this are used quite a lot in the industry. In fact, it mentions that this is one of the services that LinkedIn provides, the ability to give clients a preferred list of job applicants who have applied via LinkedIn for those jobs. And so presumably all of these same issues at least could turn out to apply in that case. So what's the ethical discussion here? It's what's the right way to approach this? Should we decide that it's just not ethical to use algorithms in the hiring process? Should we decide that they can be used, but they need human oversight? Should we decide that it would be fine to use a totally algorithmic process as long as we are a lot better at how we train those algorithms? Or does it need to be some combination? And as is the case in most of these more advanced topics, my role is not to say that there's a right answer to that, but to simply to get you to be thinking about these issues. So now, just having discussed the limitations of algorithmic-based hiring processes, as in the last class, the next article talks about the flip side of this. This is the article, Can an Algorithm Hire Better Than a Human? Published in the New York Times. And the basic point of this algorithm, or this article rather, is that people have biases as well, and particularly in the hiring process, these can be pretty big biases. And the biggest bias of those is that all of us, by human nature, tend to go for people who are like us. Let me illustrate this with a total aside of a story. There's a classic movie called The Sting, starring Paul Newman and Robert Redford when Robert Redford was quite young. And Redford plays a minor criminal who comes from Chicago who needs to ingratiate himself to a mobster and a fairly grumpy person. And so he learns where that person is from. He finds out that that person is from what may have been a fictional place, I'm not sure, in New York City called 5 Points. And so at one point he gets that person to ask him where he is from. And he says, oh, I'm from this area in New York City called 5 Points. And right away, that grumpy criminal warms up to him. So people are like that. We tend to go for people who are like us. We have biases. And the article in the New York Times quotes from a person from a firm that produces algorithmic based hiring software who says that for that reason, it improves the diversity with respect to age, gender, and educational background. And then it counters with a quote from a person at an executive search firm for the tech industry. And I want to read this one to you. That person said, quote, I look for passion and hustle, and there's no data algorithm that could ever get to the bottom of that. It's an intuition, gut feel, chemistry. And then the article makes the point that is essentially the same one as my 5-point story, that intuition leads to hiring people like you. And it claims that algorithmic-based hiring can be much more open about who to consider than humans tend to be, and talks about some of the aspects that you should look at, such as the ability to work well in teams. It also, by the way, talks about some just fundamentally sound, unbiased hiring practices that I know I've learned to apply, such as making sure that a search committee has a set of questions and asks each one of the candidates the same questions. I doubt that this article resolves the issues about whether algorithmic hiring is a better practice than human-based, but as we've seen in other topics, it points out that there's weaknesses and liabilities to both. As a final comment, the algorithm also discusses at the end the issue of job postings, and this gets back to a comment I made a few minutes ago. It talks about the language in those job postings. In the Amazon hiring, we learned that the language that people use in their cover letters can correlate to gender and can lead to biases if people think that they like people who use certain sorts of words. Well, the opposite can happen too. The language that is used in job ads can have an effect on whether people think that this is the right job for them. This is quite well understood by now. As an example, even though we've come to a world, at least in the United States and many other places, where both men and women participate in sports to a large extent, it's still been found that use of extensive sports languages, like saying, I want someone to quarterback our team, tend to give a male vibe and make men more likely to apply than women. So there's a bias there as well, not an algorithmic bias, but one that is analogous to the algorithmic bias. Now, what's interesting, getting back to algorithms, is that by now there are nice algorithmic tools, as well as other sorts of advice, that can help you look for and eliminate those sorts of biases in your job ads. And if you're in that position, you can find a lot of that online. I'll point out that if you look up online NCWIT, the National Center for Women in IT, tools for writing better job ads, you'll see good resources.